Okay, good afternoon. Let's get started. My name is Yvette Subramanian. I'm here at CITRIS, and welcome to today's Research Exchange. There are a few announcements, as always, before we get started. Thank you to Infineon, who sponsors the lunch that you're all enjoying here. Welcome to the webcasters, people who are watching online. Hi, everybody at the other campuses. And we have the Big Ideas competition. I don't know if any of you here have entered that, but we still have not decided who the finalists are. The poster session will be next Thursday. Next Thursday, I think it's the 21st, from 3 to 5 p.m. But we still haven't quite gotten all the judges to agree on who those top finalists are. So if you're part of Big Ideas and you're wondering if you're going to find out, we should know by today at 2 p.m., and that announcement will go out shortly. So today we have Professor John Chuang from the School of Information at UC Berkeley. He is a Ph.D. in Engineering and Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon University. He's been in the School of Information here at Berkeley since 1999, and his research is on economics-informed design of computer networks and distributed systems. He's going to talk to us today with a talk called Secure, Insure, or Ignore, the Economics of Information Security. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you, Yvette. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to talk about information security, which is a topic that is really in our collective consciousness, in today's society. Whether at the individual level, where we have to deal with all the email spams, or if we're a company like Google who has to defend against hackers and spies, or even at the governmental level, where terms like cyber terrorism, cyber war roll off the tongue of policymakers. So this is what I want to talk about today. Regardless of whether you're an individual or a company or a government, it really boils down to a set of questions that is common across all these levels, which is, are we really spending enough on security? Are we spending too little? Are we spending too much? How secure is secure, right? These are the set of questions that were first posed by Ross Anderson, who's a computer scientist, and Hal Varian, an economist, when they first co-founded this workshop, bringing together researchers from multiple disciplines to come together and ask this set of questions. This workshop, this community has been going strong for the last 8 years. And you will see as you follow the advances of research in this community that it revolves around this central question of how do we make decisions in a rational manner when it comes to information security. In the early days, it started with, if you are one defender and you take a risk management approach to dealing with the question of are we investing too little, too much, or in security. Over time, there's recognition that when we talk about system security, there is usually not just one single defender or one single decision maker, but multiple defenders all making independent decisions, but nonetheless having some interdependency that results. So that brings in questions like public goods versus private goods from the economics literature that is quite pertinent in this set of questions. And then finally, where we are today, much more sophisticated views of the fact that there are different types of attacks, different types of defenses, and therefore, the picture is necessarily much more nuanced than what we have from 8 years ago when it first started. So what I hope to do today in the 40 minutes is to take you through very quickly, starting from some of the fundamental questions that were raised and ultimately ending at some work that my group has been working on, specifically looking at things like the weakest target game and the distinction between protection and insurance, and how the findings from our work help inform this much bigger picture, much bigger question about rational decision making. So if we start from the very beginning, as I said, information security investment decision making can be approached from a risk management perspective. This is, in fact, very well understood in traditional engineering. Whether you're building a bridge or building a nuclear power plant, we can quantify risk as the product of the probability that some accident occurs, P, and in the event of an accident, the magnitude of the loss, L. So when we take P times L and call that risk, we can also interpret that as expected loss of a system in the event of some failure. Given that, it is easy, straightforward for us to then perform cost-benefit analysis of different alternatives that you might apply to mitigate the risk. Right? When I was in graduate school, I took a class on policy analysis, and we were taught that when you do cost-benefit analysis, in the example of highway safety regulation, that you can assign P's and L's, and in the case of L, you can, if you're thinking about statistical deaths avoided by introduction of, say, seat belts in cars, that you can pick values like $1 million in value per statistical death avoided and plug those numbers into your analysis. So we can do something very similar in the context of information security. Here are a couple of scenarios that you can imagine. Right, scenario number one, there's some new technology that promises to fix a security vulnerability. You are the CSO, Chief Security Officer of a company. You have to decide whether you want to invest in this new security mechanism. On the one hand, the risk or the expected loss is a function of P times L, as we said, probability of breach multiplied by the loss in the event of a security breach. And on the other side, there's a cost associated with deploying this security mechanism. So the question is, should you, as a CSO, invest in such a mechanism? Scenario two, at the individual level, you visit a web page, you're asked to type in some personal information, and you have to decide whether you want to proceed with this transaction or not. On the one hand, you may obtain some value by completing this particular transaction, right? You're trying to buy something. On the other hand, there may be a probability P that this personal information may be stolen, and in the case of identity theft, then there's an L associated with that loss. So you would want to think about making a cost-benefit analysis and deciding whether you want to enter the information. In both cases, right, we can easily plug in numbers, and depending on how they shake out, you decide one way or the other. It seems seductively simple, adopting a risk management approach to information security. Obviously, you need to think about what type of assumptions are being made when you adopt this approach. Turns out that there are many assumptions that we make, right? First of all, there is difficulty in risk assessment, especially for events where the probabilities might be very small and the losses might be very large. When you multiply a very small number with a very large number, the results may be off by orders of magnitude. So that immediately raises questions about the validity of the cost-benefit analysis that you perform. Secondly, by talking about expected loss or expected values, we are assuming that users are trying to maximize expected utility. But in reality, users may not, or may not even want to do so. This really strongly depends on the risk attitudes of the individual decision maker, whether they're risk neutral or risk averse or risk seeking. We have an example that illustrates this point coming up. And there are a bunch of other more subtle assumptions that will lead to this cost-benefit analysis approach to be problematic, like hyperbolic discounting, framing, prospect theory. Let me, in fact, try a little exercise on the audience here. This really illustrates the point of prospect theory as forwarded by Kahneman and Tversky, and for which Kahneman was awarded a Nobel Prize in economics. Just a simple experiment. We have a healthy group of people here in this room. Imagine that you're presented with these two choices, right? You're going to win $500 with certainty. You're going to walk home with $500 for sure today, or you can participate in the lottery where there's a 50% chance that you'll win $1,000, and there's a 50% chance that you'll win nothing. So with a show of hands, humor me, I'd like to see how many people would prefer choice number one. I don't know, that looks like 90%. How many people would prefer choice number two? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 people. 7. How many people might be indifferent between choice 1 and 2? We have one brave soul who's indifferent between the two. Excellent. So clearly, if we talk about all three choices, or both choices, the expected value is the same, right? If you multiply P times the value, in both cases it's $500. But clearly, we see that different people have different preferences, which illustrates the differences in risk attitudes that you might have. Let me do it in a different way, with a different set of choices. Now, choice number one, you are to lose $500 for sure. Choice number two, you play the lottery, and with 50% chance, you have to lose $1,000, but with 50% chance, you don't have to pay anything. Now, that's with a show of hands. How many of you would now prefer choice number one? A small number. How many of you would prefer choice number two? Right, a much larger majority. Anyone that's indifferent between the two. So now we have a few people who are risk neutral between these two choices. All right. A couple of takeaways. All of you have seen how you have all voted. 2 takeaways. Number one, there's no right or wrong answer here, right? Individuals have different preferences for one choice or the other, or might be indifferent. This is simply a function of our individual preferences about risks, risk attitudes. Secondly, what's more interestingly and perhaps more pertinent to information security is that people who were risk-seeking in the first scenario have turned and become risk-averse. I'm sorry, the other way around. People who were risk-averse in the first scenario had turned around and become risk-seeking when the prospects were that you're going to lose money. Okay? People become more risk-seeking, more willing to take the chance, to take the lottery, when the signs of the payoffs become negative. It's the same people, right? Some of you, many of you in this room fall into that category. What that suggests to us is that when thinking about information security scenarios, where most of the time we are thinking about defending against some possible loss, right? Investing in some effort to keep your computer secure in exchange for some probability that your machine will not be compromised or your identity will not be stolen, that falls squarely into the second scenario. And yet, this is the scenario where people become more risk-seeking. People are willing to take chances. People are willing to forego doing the hard work today with the hope of possibly avoiding some large loss down the road. Right? So this is a very simple example that illustrates how prospect theory can inform how difficult information security decision-making might be. By the way, the numbers in this room is pretty consistent, I believe, with what Kahneman and Tversky found in their experiments of human subjects, as you see in those numbers up there. Moving from one defender to multiple defenders, we recognize that there are interdependencies. Conventional wisdom says that, oh, a system is only as secure as its weakest link. But in reality, the security of entire system is often dependent on that of individual components. And furthermore, the security of individual players actually depends on not just their own decisions, but also the decisions of their cohort. So we have a picture where we have many defenders who are trying to defend against some threat, and they have to make decisions on how much to invest in security or how high a wall I want to build. But the effective security of the entire system is going to depend on not just the height of each individual section, but actually the section, the height of walls across all the different sections. Depending on the type of attacks that you're dealing with, whether they are perimeter defense or censorship resistance, there are different functions that you can apply to try to estimate what the effective security of the entire system is. These terms, weakest link, total effort, best shot, actually come from the economics literature on public goods. And ultimately, we are able to express the effectiveness in utility functions that will be realized for each individual player. And as you see here, down in the middle of the slide, the amount of protection that you can afford is a function of not just the investments by player I, but also investments by all the other players. If you are playing a weakest link game, then it is the minimum investment across all the players that's going to dictate the protection level. If you are playing the best shot game, then it's the maximum. And if you are playing the total effort, then it is a summation of all the efforts. You plug this protection function in here into the utility function at the top. This term, 1 minus h, is basically how much you can mitigate the risk, where risk, as we have seen before, is P times L. Right? So for every player I, you're faced with some expected loss P times L. You would like to mitigate it by this protection function. But these protections are costly, so you have to pay a unit price of B for every amount of EI that you invest in. This basically maps very nicely into the standard public goods model in economics, and therefore, as Varian has found, all the standard results from that literature applies. So investment in security becomes a public good. Therefore, we're going to have free riding. People are going to count on others to invest in security. And ultimately, that means that we have a suboptimal provisioning of this public good. Now, going from that very standard result, let's take us to the next step, where we want to acknowledge the fact that there are different types of attacks, different types of defenses. And so we want to see how we can enrich the analysis and also the findings. Let's start with different types of defenses. First of all, we can immediately recognize that of the various different types of defenses that we can deploy, they fall into two categories. Either those that can reduce the probability P of loss, or those that can reduce the magnitude of loss in the event of a loss. So we can call the first type of mechanisms protection mechanisms, and the second insurance. And as you can see here, there are some examples of security solutions in each category. the original model, where we are simply interested in the product P times L, it really doesn't matter whether you're investing in protection or insurance. However, we begin to recognize that actually protection-based mechanisms and insurance-based mechanisms lead to very different incentives from the point of view of the defenders. So we can model mathematically the three different scenarios where, as in the previous case, we only consider the possibility of protection. This equation is no different from the previous one. The second scenario where we can only invest in insurance solutions, in which case now we can mitigate the loss by 1 minus SI, where SI is the insurance level. Similarly, insurance has a cost C per unit. Or we can have a situation where users can choose to invest in one or the other. So now we can invest in either protection or security or both, and both will contribute to a mitigation of the risk. When confronted with these two different choices, right, the question is, how should the player allocate my budget between one or the other? It's like this person here, right? On the one hand, deciding how much money do I want to spend to build a high wall. On the other hand, I can also choose to spend some of my money to buy insurance. So in case that the wall gets breached, there's going to be a flood, I'm going to have my life raft. The important insight here is that while protection is a public good, right, the height of the wall benefits not just me, but also my neighbors, insurance is inherently a private good, right? If you're backing up data, that data is only valuable to you, not to other players in the game. We are able to apply game theory to try to analyze the dynamics in such a situation. And we do so for the different types of canonical games that I said earlier. For now, in the interest of time, let's just focus on the weakest link game, where the protection function is limited by the minimum investment across all the different players. So what do we find? In contrast to the standard public goods result, where we found that free riding is the dominant strategy, here we find that depending on the cost of protection, the cost of insurance, and the actual risk of the game, the Nash equilibria, the solutions that may, the outcomes that we may actually see in practice, can be either to secure, that is, all the players spend the money in protection, to insure, which is, let's not build any walls at all, let's all go and buy our own lifeboats, or to ignore, that is, to give up and say that, no matter what I do, whether I invest in security or in insurance, it's not going to help, it's a lost cause, and I'm going to just ignore. Furthermore, as the number of players increases, and this is very relevant when we talk about network security, when we have a large number of players, the protection equilibria becomes less and less tenable. They collapse. Basically, people say that as there are more and more players playing this game, which is a weakest link game in this case, it is hopeless for me to contemplate spending any money building a wall. As long as one person decides not to spend any money to build up a wall, then the wall is going to be easily breached. Therefore, I'm much better off insuring. So that's what the theory says. We are actually able to try it out with human subjects in a lab setting. So here we have some results from 3 players playing the weakest link game, where they have to make decisions of how much money to spend in protection versus insurance. you'll see that the results in the lab setting is in fact much more noisy than what the theory predicts. But nonetheless, we do see players learning and eventually adopting into a strategy where they just spend all their budget on insurance, not on protection. And in fact, this learning can oftentimes be reinforced when they choose other strategies, they get compromised as a result. Now, in the remaining 10 minutes, I want to switch gears and talk about different classes of attacks and how they may not be easily modeled by the canonical weakest link models. These days, what's very much in the news is the rise and proliferation of botnets, where many individual home computers are compromised and recruited into these networks of bots, from which all the common security attacks are launched, like the sending of email spam, click fraud, distributed denial of service attacks, and so on and so forth. What we, in thinking about botnets and how botnet herders are able to build up that network, we realized that none of the three models we had considered, the weakest link or the best shot or the total effort games, could capture what's actually going on here, right? Instead, it is more of a weakest target game, whereby the attacker on the bottom right is not interested in compromising each and every single player, but is instead interested in just compromising a subset of the players with the minimum amount of effort necessary, right? So they go after the computers that are the least protected, and once they have gathered a sufficient threshold number of machines into the botnets, they can go ahead and operate. So that motivated us to come up with this different way of thinking about the incentive dynamics and a different protection function, right? So in this case, you are not protected at all if your investment level is the minimum across all the different players, right? So you would be one of these three red players. On the other hand, if you're not a weakest target, then your protection function is 1. That is, you're completely safe from being compromised. So a very simple tweak to the protection function, and we want to see how this changes the dynamics and the equilibrium. And of course, we still want to retain the possibility that these players have this outside option of buying insurance. Right? You can intuitively imagine that it may actually make sense that some players may choose to be a weakest target, but know that the magnitude of loss is going to be significantly constrained because of insurance. So applying the same game theoretic methods, we are able to see that in this weakest target game, while Nash equilibria does not exist, there are mixed Nash equilibria that exist. So in that sense, it's not very different from the earlier games that we talked about, right? Secure, insure, and ignore are all possible equilibria in this game. However, what's different now is that as the number of players increases, or as the network size increases, previously, in the weakest link game, we found that protection became less and less tenable. Whereas now, in the weakest target game, it is actually full insurance that becomes less and less likely. Question?
What do you assume that the different players know about the security level?
Yes. In the basic model, we have complete information. So we assume that all the players fully understand what the utility functions look like and the structure of the game. However, in the laboratory setting that I showed you earlier, that's a limited information setting where the subjects are only aware of their own local decisions and their own local payouts. And that's one of the main reasons why it is much more noisy in a lab setting, because of the lack of complete information. But what you see here on this side in terms of the theoretical analysis is based on complete information. We do have follow-on work that actually relaxes that, and we see what limited information will do to the outcome. Another question?
Yeah, I'm doubtful about some of your assumptions. So one thing is that in the real world, there is some excellent protection software available for free.
Yes.
So there's no theoretical reason why people should be unprotected.
Yes.
Other than
Yes.
lack of information.
Yes.
And secondly, it's not the case that insurance is entirely a private good. In my department, we have professionally managed file servers that do backups.
Yes.
So
great. Both good questions. With regards to the first, when we think about cost, we need to go beyond just monetary cost, of dollars that you pay, but also include the effort, the time spent in choosing to install and deploy these systems. It's interesting to note that sometimes very small positive values are enough to tip the equilibrium one way or the other. And so, in fact, there is another generalization to this model going from Nash equilibrium to epsilon equilibrium that accounts for what small perturbations, epsilon values, could change the outcome. With regards to the second point, excellent observation that data backups, depending on how it is implemented, may not necessarily be a purely private good, that there can be public good aspects to some of these solutions as well. In fact, more generally, many of these technological interventions may actually exhibit a hybrid of both public and private goods, in which case then the picture becomes even more muddy. What we have here is a situation where we basically very cleanly separate the two, but in real world, it can be, in fact, more ambiguous as a result. So both excellent questions. Thank you. So as I was saying, when we consider a different game, as in the weakest target game, we see that a previous result where we have larger network sizes leading to the less likelihood of protection to one where now it becomes the other way around, where insurance becomes more tenable. This suggests to us that, well, obviously the picture is very complicated. One needs to, so a couple of things. One, it is important when thinking about designing defenses to recognize that for different types of attacks, these different games may apply. In fact, even worse than that, oftentimes we are actually playing multiple games at the same time, right? When we are administering our system or deciding whether we want to install some security mechanism, we are defending against not just one single attack, but many different attacks, some unknown attacks. So in reality, we are probably playing various versions of these games all at the same time. So that is an unfortunate conclusion in that it means that it may be rather difficult to tease out, to isolate, and therefore arrive at what is the optimal solution, what is the optimal strategy to adopt in face of a combination of different types of attacks. So to conclude, here are a couple of types of next steps that one could take, not just within our group, but also in the broader community. In terms of understanding, what I presented today are, in a sense, the first steps, the basic models of trying to understand the dynamics of information security. We are able to, create or produce some nuances in terms of the different types of attacks and different type of defenses. But nonetheless, to push this further, we need to relax many assumptions that are made in these modeling efforts. Going from a population of homogeneous users to one that is heterogeneous, recognizing that there are individuals as well as corporations who may be defenders with different resources and different risk attitudes. Limited information. This we have begun to explore both in terms of theoretical setting as well as in the lab setting. And what we really like to do is to inform our work with empirical analysis. So that's on the understanding side. And then on the intervention side, we would like to, once we have gained some better understanding of what the problem and problem space and solution space might be, to think about how we could intervene. Is it possible for us to introduce incentives as intermediaries? So if you are an ISP or if you are a software developer, you are, is there some ways in which you could create incentives for either protection or insurance? For example, can I modify the cost of protection, reduce it, so that I can, in fact, let me pick a very specific example. If you are an ISP, you are an intermediary, is it possible for you to imagine where you introduce some type of financial incentive? For example, if you, as a subscriber, is able to demonstrate that you have performed these steps, the installation of antivirus software in a demonstrable way, then I will give you at the end of a month a $5 rebate for your effort, right? That's a very explicit incentive that can be introduced, and we'd like to see how that might or might not be effective in influencing behavior. If $5 is not enough, then how about $7? Or is $5 too much? $3 or even $1 is sufficient, right? How do we begin to answer those questions? Hopefully by having a quantitative model that's backed up by empirical evidence that will allow us to make some headways into thinking about possible interventions and their effectiveness. There are lots of different directions that this can take, looking at the use of default settings. If in any of these interventions, there will always be some residual risk. How do you manage this residual risk? How can assignment of liability be used to influence behavior? So lots of different directions. If you are interested in exploring more, there's a link to my research group with papers that were written on this topic. And I think this is a good time for me to stop and see if there are any more questions. Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
First, I apologize for myself. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we have another lecture about smart grid and so-called smart grid home area network protection issues.
Yes.
And I don't think we talk about insurance, but that has to do with our future in terms of developing this type of smart grid for the California or beyond. I don't know if you know anyone who is doing that kind of research, or your group is doing that.
I'm not familiar with the talk that you're talking about, but more generally, I think smart grid is a good example of an infrastructure that is distributed and potentially administered by lots of different autonomous entities. And so that is yet another good example of interdependent security, where I think what the framework that we have here could be applied to studying that. And so, it would be interesting, I think, to find out whether the designers of these next-generation smart grids consider both protection as well as insurance options, what they actually mean, how do you actually realize those, and what's the best way forward in terms of thinking about choosing the alternatives. So great application, I think, for this work.
Do you know how the picture changes when you have a limited information attacker?
Yes. So actually, in the models that I've talked about today, we consider attackers to be exogenous. A natural next step, which is something that I don't believe anyone has taken, so I think that's a good open question, is not only do you endogenize the attackers, but also consider the fact that attackers have limited information. Then how might that modify the behavior of the defenders? So I think that is an open question that I think it's definitely worth exploring.
I hope you didn't say this and I was just not paying attention, but are there any examples of actual security policies that have been changed due to this work and where security professionals said, you suggested a strategy we did not think of and we are actually using it?
I think it is too early, perhaps, to tell whether there is actual changes in behavior. I would love to hear reports of that to be the case. I think one thing that we have encountered in the course of our research is that it is, in fact, oftentimes a challenge to get data from industry about events or about practices. Part of this lack of transparency may be considered to be, just part of the strategy more broadly in defending against the attacks. There are anecdotal stories I've heard, thinking about banks, financial institutions, and how they, on the one hand, wishes to get together with each other, recognizing that there is some interdependent nature in the collection of financial institutions. But on the other hand, also resisting information sharing for competitive reasons. So I would, personally, as a researcher, I would definitely welcome greater accessibility to data, to best practices. But I can understand, the reluctance on their part as well.
Are there any particular situations where someone says this model fits and it's giving me an insight, even if they haven't implemented a strategy?
So I think we do have feedback from researchers from industry who says, yes, this makes sense. We would definitely like to be able to calibrate this. And the calibration process itself is often problematic. There is, by the way, a budding insurance for industry for cyber insurance. This is going back to the risk management approach to this problem. But the industry has been faced with the challenge of the lack of historical data. This is very different from buying home insurance or car insurance, where there is much fewer data points available for them to build accurate models. So that's just yet another example where I think, in general, this field, this research field, can benefit from some more collaboration with industry, particularly with regards to collection of data.
Okay, well, please run.
Thank you very much for your attention.